Welcome to Communicating Earth, the podcast by and for climate communicators. It gives me great pleasure this week to welcome Dr. James Dyke. He's an associate professor in Earth Systems Science, director of Environmental Intelligence CDT, and assistant director of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. He's also a fellow of European Geophysical Union, the Earth League, the Higher Education Academy, and the Royal Society of Arts. He co-authored the famous article Net Zero is a Dangerous Trap in 2021, which argued that the net zero concept licenses a reckless, cavalier, burn now, pain later approach based on technological fixes that do not yet exist, indeed will they ever exist, and which has seen carbon emissions continue to rise year on year. Most importantly, and why I asked him to appear on this podcast, is he is one of the very best climate science communicators I have ever met. And he can pull off that rare magic trick, clearly explaining the severity of the polycrisis while leaving his audiences energized to take action. James, welcome.
Thank you for having me. What a wonderful biography. I feel I should carry you around with me at all times.
I'm 6'3". That might be quite hard.
A little pocket version or something.
Okay. Very good. So we, as we say at the start of every week, this podcast is based around the theory that action inspires action.
Mm-hmm.
So why, firstly, do you think that more action, despite the overwhelming evidence, is not being taken?
Well, that's an easy one to start with. I mean, one-word answers would be greed, stupidity, denial. Let's remind ourselves that there has been, for a significant amount of time, a significant majority support for climate action. It's not as if we're proposing anything that's weird or odd or radical or strange. The vast majority of people want to live on a planet that's got a habitable climate, that's going to be somewhere safe for them to live and for their kids to grow up. And maybe that might be associated with a more equitable distribution of the finite resources that we have. And that has been the case for many years and will continue to be the case. Now, the reason we don't see effective climate action is because a tiny handful of humanity has everything to lose, because they have accrued tremendous amounts of wealth and power through pumping, digging, mining, transporting, burning, exploiting hydrocarbons. I'm sure you've had other contributors give you a much more detailed assessment analysis of the politics of it, the economics. But in my simple-minded assessment, that's why we continue to see insufficient action, why we continue to see delay.
And what about like behavior itself? So there is this this idea that it's action that inspires action, it's action that drives behavioral change rather than the other way around, rather than sort of awareness raising, doing it first. I mean, do you think that's perhaps a sort of flaw of the scientific community? Because basically you've succeeded, right? We have 89% of the world's population knowing the severity of the climate action, wanting their governments to do more. So the awareness has been raised. So what about maybe translating that scientific research into actual stories of action itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. Climate science has been very good at generating the information, but we don't have an information deficit. We've got a saliency deficit and an action deficit. So it's not, when it comes to communications, when it comes to inspiring people to affect change, affect behavioral change, individual behavioral change, that's really important. But of course, we need change operating at many, many levels. And sometimes you can just put that into a big bucket called system change. We need all of that. But we need to contextualize and make it important to people. So in terms of comms, it's as much about people as it is planet. People don't, and it sounds patronizing, but most people don't understand what a carbon budget is, or radiative forcing, or energy imbalance. They want to understand, how do climate policies make their lives materially better, not by the middle of the century, but now. And there must be, and I think some of the emergence of progressive left-wing green politics is showing that there are abundant opportunities where you can have those things together.
Yeah, there is this idea that somehow you're solving something and you're not going to see the benefit for decades. But look at what happened with air quality in ULEZ. I mean, that's an immediate effect. I can feel it myself when I'm going into London now from a year or two ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they fought that tooth and nail. A certain
Yeah.
a certain proportion of the population, but also certain vested interests. So even when you've got something like that, you can point to the really clear, credible science. Kids are being impacted. There have actually been legal cases where there was a premature death with a young girl attributed to air quality. When you add in all the other immediate health impacts, as well as the impacts it got on community, on noise disruption, it stops you from interacting with your neighbors, right? You've got this tremendously powerful evidence base, and it's still right. It's still an uphill battle, a continual battle. And I've been involved in a couple of projects where low traffic neighborhoods have been implemented and they've been removed, right? Because that kind of counter action, that insurgency against them was effectively more powerful than what you might consider to be the more progressive, inclusive, community-driven actions that implemented them in the first place.
Mm. So you've got involved at a local level. Like what's you the person, you the man, James. What's a favourite tale of action that you've got involved in that you'd like to share with the audience?
I've helped where I can. So in some respects, I can be a useful idiot when it comes to providing some support for a community-led initiative, which could be about active transport or it could be about air quality, all the way up to maybe even contributions to potential national legislation. You mentioned the net zero article in my bio. Thank you very much. I need to be honest with you, and perhaps it's not very surprising, that was quite a polarizing article. I got quite a bit of support for it, and I also got quite a bit of grief because I was stepping over that invisible line that's meant to separate academia from activism, or I refused to stay in my lane, right? And much of the work that I did before and I continue to do now is to try to encourage other academics, not necessarily to speak out in a very dramatic way, but just to critically reflect on how they engage, the kind of comms they're doing, and what they are either explicitly or tacitly supporting.
So let's go back a bit more into that actual article in 2021. Like, how did it come about? Whose idea was it? What partnerships happened behind the scenes? I want to understand a bit more about the process that led to the publication, and then beyond that, to the reaction.
Okay, so it emerged out of some conversations that I was having initially, well, actually, continually through the conversation, because that's where the article was published. And I've been writing for the conversation since I think 2013 now, and I've written some kind of long read type pieces for them previously. And I had the idea that we academics, climate scientists or climate academia needed to be much more clear about net zero, because what I could see happening was there was this narrative of net zero. And now that narrative of net zero is transforming into overshoot, which was basically, don't worry, we don't need to rapidly decarbonize because we can just take the carbon dioxide out of the air at some point in the future. And we've all heard of carbon offsets, that we can jump on a plane and we can do that guilt-free because they'll plant a bunch of trees. Well, net zero kind of plays that forward and allows us to overshoot 1.5 or 2 or any amount of carbon, any amount of warming. And then some point in the middle of this century and then far beyond, we'll just take it out through not just planting trees, but through direct air capture or some kind of technology. And of course, those technologies don't exist. They were invented to balance the carbon books. And everybody involved in integrated assessment modeling and the climate science around policies and pathways knows that. They know they don't exist. There is significant skepticism about whether they're ever going to exist at any kind of scale. And yet nobody was really saying that. There was a strange game, this kind of, you have to be policy relevant. You can't say things that politicians aren't going to want to champion, and they're not going to want to champion rapid fossil fuel phase out, so nobody says anything. So I did some work with a climate scientist called Wolfgang Knorr, who's largely retired from climate science because he became increasingly frustrated about these kind of tensions. We also involved Bob Watson, so Robert Watson, who was a previous chair of the IPCC and the IPBES. And then through working with our editors at the conversation, that included Jordan Rain and Josephine Lethbridge, we concocted this long read over a process of a couple of months, really. And released it out into the wild, not really thinking many people would read it. So it was both surprising and gratifying that it produced the kind of impact that it did.
It's amazing, right? I mean, it was like 500,000 downloads. I mean, what were the readership figures?
I honestly don't know, because I don't think they actually captured it. Went out through, it was co-published through Apple News as well, and I don't think they were able to capture all the engagements they got through that. But it certainly generated a very large number of downloads. But from my perspective, I saw a lot of interest, and I got invited to do lots of events afterwards, some of which I became the net zero skeptic. I don't know, maybe Nigel Farage wasn't available or something, but I was the guy, but a skeptic in the sense that this mainstream kind of climate narrative of, yes, we need to decarbonize, but not too fast. And I discovered for about a year or two, maybe even longer, I would be invited to panels as the kind of the cryptic skeptic, right? The person who was kind of dissenting from this kind of mainstream consensus, which led to all sorts of interesting interactions, if I could call them that.
Farage comparison there is interesting. Were there ever examples of you getting co-opted by people who thought you were on their side?
This happened before, yeah. So there's obviously a real politicization of net zero. There was largely driven by what was then the Conservative Party. Well, when we had a Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, it was the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, and there was Net Zero Watch, but they were just using as a synonym for anything to do with climate change. And I was very sensitive to the potential for criticisms or critiques of net zero being used by people, organizations, political forces that don't want to do anything about climate change. And I do appreciate their attentions there, but that doesn't mean we need to have some kind of a omerta that we can't say anything critical. We can't point out some of the structural issues with the current approach that we're taking to climate policy. So I guess it ruffled a few feathers. But the message of, look, we need to rapidly decarbonize, that needs to be central. And then you need to figure out what would need to happen to facilitate that. In my simple-minded approach, in my very naive approach, that's what I thought everybody else thought. And it was a voyage of discovery when you realize that's not what they think at all.
How was that opposing opinion or thought communicated to you? Like what was the feedback or the pushback, or how did the ruffling of feathers manifest themselves in your lives in the weeks or months or years after the article's publication?
I mean, there was some scathing criticism from academics, which was basically like a tut or a cutting sigh, right? Which speaks volumes. I was being quite outspoken around 1.5 as well. I was saying we're not going to limit warming to no more than 1.5. No one thinks we're going to limit warming to no more than 1.5. There's very little carbon budget available for 1.5, and emissions are going up. It's just not going to happen. And that really did, and I understand why that really did upset people. And I was insensitive at times, because I do appreciate that you've got to, if 1.5 is a stretch goal, right, you're using it to try to, motivate action, increase ambition. And I do appreciate that. But there's got to be a bottom line, right? You can't propose things that you don't genuinely believe are possible or plausible. And my argument then, and actually it's still my argument now, when we pass 1.5, which we're in the process of doing, right? So when we do, what's the narrative then? What's the coordinating battle cry for climate action? Because 1.5 is in the rear mirror, right? And if we don't come up with a credible story about how we're going to avoid further dangerous climate change, how we're going to really rapidly accelerate adaptation and deal with the increasing loss and damages, if we don't do that, others will, and they'll come up with narratives that we probably don't like. And to be honest, I'm still disappointed at how sparse that space has been populated, given just the simple, brutal reality of what is unfolding in the climate.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think there isn't a bigger space created?
Look, there is some denial. I'm in denial about a whole bunch of things, and I think it's fair to point out there's probably denial elsewhere. I also think that you can't maintain this narrative, I call it the kind of climate centrism narrative around 1.5, and admit that 1.5 is over. You can only admit an overshoot, a temporary overshoot, and then it's all about getting back. And what has been frustrating, it's only been relatively recently that the client science community has been making it clear that no, you just can't come back. What goes up might not just come back down. There is going to be irreversible changes to the climate put in place. We've already done it. The loss and damages that we're going to produce, the species that we're going to lose, the people that we're going to die, they don't suddenly reanimate if we were able to lower temperatures at some point, if we are at all. And the other thing around the overshoot narrative is that we are committing ourselves to not just years or decades, but potentially centuries of efforts to try to get that carbon dioxide out of the air with some other combination of solar geoengineering. It's this kind of Frankensteinian monster that we are building that nobody wants to talk about for a whole bunch of different reasons. And that is very frustrating. And we are just continuing to cede the space to those who essentially argue, don't worry, there's nothing to panic about. We can progressively phase out gas as a bridge fuel, all the other malarkey that they get up to.
Okay, so you've got a thought experiment, James. Like you've got the 300 most powerful climate communicators in the world, who are all sold, who are all brave, who are prepared, because everyone's sold, right? But they're all brave. And what would you advise them to do specifically from a communications perspective?
So this is from a comms perspective.
Yeah, because this podcast is all about comms. It's all about comms, I'm interested in what you say about the line between academia and activism. And from what you're saying, this article in your brain seems to be like an act of activism to a certain extent, because you're bucking the trend, because you're going out there. It's like, even though it is in and of itself a piece of communication, it's like it needs a communications campaign around it as well, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. So what form does that communications campaign take, do you think? What does it look like?
I suppose what it needs to have is the on-ramps, and that was the genius of the 2015 Paris Agreement, which is where net zero comes from, I would argue. Back in 2015, you had the international community agree they're going to limit warming to well below 2, and that's now come to be understood as 1.5. And if you were serious about that, you would have seen 11 years ago now the immediate phase out, or the commencement of a phase out of fossil fuels, because the carbon budget is just so small, and that didn't happen. But you couldn't have imposed that on the Paris Agreement, because the United States would have never have signed up, or Germany, or the United Kingdom. Pretty much no nation which emits a significant amount of carbon dioxide would, because for a whole bunch of political reasons, right? So I guess what we need to do now is we need to provide on-ramps given the reality. And I would say the reality of the situation is the climate crisis is going to get an awful lot worse. There's going to be increasing loss and damages, more devastating storms, more social disruption, more displacement, migration. And if you think those things are going to make any of your immediate proximate political challenges any easier, then you're obviously very deluded. So we need to provide ways in which we can think about solving the political issues of today at the same time as having to address what is going to be increasing and escalating stresses on society. Now, of course, the fundamental challenge that I've got when I present that is that I can't argue it's going to make you any money. I can't provide, maybe I need to think about it a bit more, but I can't think about an app or a product or a service which is going to collectively or ultimately contribute to the increasing a country's GDP or the total size of the global economy. I just can't see how that's going to happen, because in some instances, I think we do need to use less energy materials in some places, right? It's not necessarily a kind of a global degrowth agenda. So how do we do that? Well, I would argue that we do that by thinking about how we use the existing levels of resources, given the vast inequalities they've got. And that just doesn't mean a kind of a leap to populist, blame all the billionaires and we'll solve everything by just increasing taxation on the, like the 1% or the 0.1%. But it does mean thinking about, well, what's the point of our economies? In whose interest do they serve? what's the point of all these goods and services they generate if it just moves us further and further to this kind of calamitous outcome, whilst we at the same time can't even put food on the table and can't even keep people's homes warm? There are abundant opportunities for us to be able to solve all of those issues at the same time through a spectrum of climate policies which put people and planet. So it's not just planet, it's not just people, it's both.
So you say that obviously it's hard to see where the profit lies in solving the climate crisis, but there's definitely money to be saved through solving the climate crisis. There's more and more reports out there that show that it's going to cost X trillion dollars
Mhm.
in mitigating extreme weather event damage and so on. Is there some way in which we can harvest those reports that are coming out?
There are reports, but they need to be understood in the assumption, the mainstream assumption that operates within almost every companies, I guess, and certainly most national governments, that pretty much all of humanity's problems will be solved by growth, right? So the issue with climate change is that climate change may at some point begin to degrade that rate of growth, right? So by the end of the century, you might imagine a global economy that's 2, 3, 4 times bigger. But when you add in climate change, it might only be, 2 times bigger. So it's like an opportunity cost. It's this kind of marginal drag on economic growth. And of course, that's wrong. There's a whole bunch of just basic science that can point out that the impacts that we are experiencing are at the tail edge, like they're worse than we thought they were going to be. You've got looming tipping points, which means there could be the potential for kind of catastrophic unspiraling of many of the, or some of the Earth's crucial life support systems. So by motivating it in terms of avoidance of damage at some point doesn't necessarily address the proximate need to generate profits now, right? So one thing that's motivated climate action has been through essentially marketing, right? So you position your company as a company that's got an effective net zero strategy, it's being progressive, it's doing what it can to reduce its climate impacts. Therefore, you're going to increase your market share with respect to the competitors in your space, right? But it's still essentially a growth-based approach, right? And when it works well, that means you might be able to suppress some actors which are doing really bad things. I mean, a classic example would be let's replace oil and gas with renewables, right? So renewables have got impacts. There's mining impacts. There's a whole bunch of impacts, but they are nothing like as bad as the continual extraction of billions of tons of fossil fuels, right? So we could think about it in those terms, but collectively, I'm not sure that's going to be sufficient. I think we need to think about deeper introspections on what's driving much of the climate crisis. And some people attribute it to capitalism or neoliberalism, the growth imperative, wherever that comes from. And that's a really hard sell. I mean, I guess pun intended.
Yeah, I mean, so you've had this article. It's had this, it made this really big splash. It's ruffled lots of feathers, and yet the space hasn't been created off the back of it. It's like a sort of microcosm of the overall problem, really. But you are a brave academic who's gone out there. Has there been any sense ever that you've been close to being cancelled? Maybe that's too
Um,
public a question,
I've
whatever that means.
I wouldn't say. I mean, I'm probably not the favorite person for some people who might be influential, and I've got to be careful what I say with regards to things I might have said about certain institutions. And I know that has really not helped me.
Okay, okay.
That's as much as I can say, I'm afraid.
Let's go back and dig a bit deeper into this boundary between academia and activism. Like, if there were more yous out there in the scientific community, do you think that would lead to more action? And indeed, what are those boundaries?
I think we need more people who can understand the science and then contextualize it in ways that can generate action. Right? I like research. I like doing research. I like researchers. I think research is important. I think we should try and find things out just because we should try and find things out, because finding things out is useful and important, but also it's just fun and cool, right? Now, when you add in that in the context of a climate and ecological crisis, it seems really important. You want an awful lot of capacity, right? Maybe state capacity to do that, right? But then you need, and I wouldn't even call it an interface, there needs to be a way to translate that in a meaningful context into, I guess, politics, right? But politics is the art of the possible, right? And if all you're doing is generating more and more volume, more stuff, it I think it very quickly saturates out. It just doesn't have any effect if you're not careful, right? And it's quite astonishing at how even, I mean, you remember during the depths of the COVID crisis and the abundant evidence around lockdowns and circuit breakers, and there was continual resistance from various factors, right? There was even when there was clear evidence. Or I'll give you another example now, vaccination programs. Let's look at the catastrophe of measles outbreaks in the United States, and this was settled science, right? I mean, this is stuff going back decades. I mean, this is, kind of 101 stuff, right? In the light of political forces and the things driving that kind of politics, if we can't engage with it, if we can't steer with it in ways that hopefully would further embed our democracies and the health of our democracies, then I think that's probably one of the most important roles that scientists or academia can play. The generation of trusted research, as much as anything can be objective, that we can collectively agree on and then take collective actions on. I think one of the great successes of reactionary right-wing political movements has been to discredit the very notion of facts. If you remember alternative facts, it's just your opinion. Decades, centuries of knowledge and scientific advance can be just entirely ignored based on someone's vibe music. And we're seeing that unfolding in the United States with regards to, immunization and public health and climate. And they won't be the only important societal issues that are going to be affected like this. So that interface, I don't know, but I do think it behoves academics, it behoves scientists to be aware of those dynamics and do what they can. I don't think we should be, and we're certainly not we're not experts. We have limited contributions in that space, but we have tremendous opportunities to support those people who do work in their space, understand what they need, understand what would help them, empower and support them. Because I guess when it comes to that arena of public debate, it is still the case that academics and scientists are one of society's more trusted voices, right? And I do understand why academics can be hesitant to join in that public discourse, because I think it would undermine their sense of objectivity, which is where they think they get that trusted sense from. But that's a very, very strange way of looking at it. If you understand something deeply, if you spent your entire working life explicating, unraveling, unpacking what, let's say, the climate crisis means, and then you don't say anything, it gives a very, very strange message. So you can have both. You can have the authority and the science, but then you can also have the concern and the humanity.
To what extent do you think your colleagues follow and indeed obey the science of climate communication itself to apply to their own scientific findings?
Well, I would say the vast majority don't at all, do they? I mean, we typically...
I agree. So why is that, do you think? Is it just because everyone's trapped in their own silos, burying their head in their books in their individual ivory towers, or is there something more going on?
I mean, this is an uncharitable explanation which will only apply to a very small fraction of academics. But I think they don't see any value or utility in it. Their notion of impact is something that you need to write for the next research excellence framework. We do these kind of regular assessments of research, and then we write our little impact statements about what patents did this work produce? How many meetings in Westminster how many commercial partnerships, right? And they just don't. I mean, that's not a box they need to tick, right? The majority of people who work in the climate space, I think, are deeply engaged, concerned. probably what drives a lot of their research, but they just don't know how to do it. Nobody gives you any training. You don't get it through your doctoral training. You probably don't get it through your postdoctoral training. When you land up as a lecturer or an associate professor or assistant professor, you will only get very superficial training on it. And then pretty soon you're just in the machine of, grant applications and teaching and assessments and supervisions. And then you will probably defer all of that to your press office. And the press office, bless them, it's not necessarily one person, but it's typically a small team, unless you're in one of the very larger universities. And the best they can do is craft a press release and, just shoot it out and see what comes back. So that notion of really embedding impact into what you do, there's not many places to do. I mean, we do it here through this kind of engaged unit of research that works through the centre of the university. And I'm certainly advocating and championing for us to do more of that. But that still continues to be the exception rather than the norm.
And you're part of the Earth League as well, and they really put themselves out there, all your fellow members. You're going and you're speaking at conferences and, you're getting celebrity endorsements in the case of Potsdam and their work with the Planetary Guardians and so on. So there is that, but is that the exception rather than the rule? And indeed, if it is the exception, would you like to see more of that type of activity?
Well, the Earth League, I mean, I imagine them all flying around with capes. Like Earth League Assemble. And we've got to be a little bit careful about positionality, but I think the Earth League composition is looking a little bit more representative. It came from a very, very esteemed group of very, very senior climate Earth system scientists who've just got very, very good networks and address books. And through that, they've been able to leverage something that I guess when you add up their collective experience, probably centuries. I mean, they're not that old, right? But they've been doing this for a long time and they're very established. And they realize that they are in a tremendously privileged position and they can do something about it. Obviously, the vast majority of us aren't, right? We got to kind of beg, borrow, steal impact. They're the ones who'll be invited. So I think they realize that collectively, given the constant opportunities they've got, they could really do something. And certainly that's what motivated some of my work, I suppose ambition, when I joined the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter, because we could see how we could generate that kind of impact too. And so folk like Tim Lenton and Tipping Points and Positive Social Tipping Points, the Global Carbon Budget, you can see how that's, and that's great, right, for the 0.001% of academics working in the space, and is collegiate as the Earth League wants to be, or the GSI wants to be. We're still looking at a situation where, most academics don't have that kind of support, can't see how they're going to join the dots between what they're doing and then having it some kind of material impacts. And I've convened numerous events where academics before, during and after have said they want more of this because they want to see how they can put in practice. What kind of material changes might they want to be involved in, given their interests and their increasing concern?
So how do we do that, James? Is it just a question of budget, or is it will, or is it mass cultural change? I mean, how do we, because I think this is absolutely fundamental to the mess we're in as a species, is that, the people who are diagnosing the problem are so very removed from the solutions to the problem.
Okay, so we shouldn't have to wait to be given permission to do it, because we're never going to be given permission to do it. So within the UK context, the funder, the organisation that distributes money from the government has made it very clear it wants research that supports economic growth, because the current priority of our government is economic growth. So if you're proposing anything that seems to be not compatible with that, post-growth, degrowth economics, well then good luck to you, okay? And that's fine, all right? It's the government's money. I guess they spend it how they want, and maybe as a democracy we should have something to say about that. But the power of academia is that, in principle, no one tells you what to do, right? So one of the greatest things about academia is nobody tells you what to do. One of the worst things is nobody tells you what not to do, and you just end up becoming massively overcommitted, and there's tremendous stress and pressure to publish, and, it's such a competitive environment. but nobody stops us from joining coalitions and creating communities. And so one of the things that sustains me is either through seeing how I can help an existing, maybe even a well-established organization, seeing how I can get involved in new communities of practice or new networks, or just talking to people and seeing what we can spin up ourselves. So there's no strategy to that. It's an ad hoc scattergun approach. But I've realized it's the kind of thing that I need to do to continually motivate myself, because I'm working with other people, and it's a tremendous privilege to do so, because they're the kind of people who can put in practice the kind of work that I'm interested in. So in some respects, being able to curate those spaces, whether you call them incubators, I don't know what, right? But curate the spaces where you can draw academics together to learn from each other, share best practice, and then collectively begin to produce the kind of impact that individually that we're never going to do. And you can see that in lots of initiatives that are starting up. And so probably that's, in terms of changing the academic landscape, that's what we need to do. I would at the same time advocate that our employers, the universities, need to understand the tremendous value in that. And I would argue that it's going to be a key part of universities demonstrating their social license, right? They need to demonstrate to society, what's the point of university? What's the point of university of education? Typically, that's just been motivated in our neoliberal kind of educational paradigm as, if you go to university, you're going to earn more money, right? There is the goods that a modern university produces is in some respect immeasurable, right? And if you're looking at the climate and ecological crisis being the greatest challenge that we've ever faced, universities should be at the center of creating the new knowledge, new ways of thinking about that, which will prove to be key elements of coming up with a solution.
What about those climate communicators and climate campaigners out there? So they've got a particular campaign, or they know that they have the eyes and ears of a particular audience, and they want to have some sort of, scientific backing behind that to be as efficacious as possible. So what advice would you give them in first, like finding the right academic, how they would go about, approaching them and recruiting them to their particular communications campaign?
There's already probably a lot of information available for free that you could just use, right? So it'll be some report or executive summary of some large project that has been published somewhere that you could already begin to utilize without anybody's permission. But if there's an area of research that you're interested in, always contact the academics involved, because 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a reply because they want to make some kind of contribution, but they don't know how. And then it's a matter of directing them to give you the information that's going to be useful given that particular context. So I'm always being told, write something that explains the relationship of this to this, right? So livestock, animal husbandry, greenhouse gas emissions, land use change. Why is it important? Why might dietary change be important? How does that relate to maybe this national context or methane? Whatever it is, they can direct them to provide the kind of evidence base that they want. So in some respects, you're getting world-leading research for free, right? Because the world-leading research, it's about the stuff that they do, right? And academics love talking about their research. And so they would, 9 times out of 10, want to be engaged and work quite collaboratively to generate the stuff that's going to be useful. Not just throw a report over the wall, but actually understand what would you need to contextualize that given the campaign or the initiative that you're running.
That's really encouraging. So the door is very much open from the academic community to be approached, and they want to help. That's the message you're giving.
Absolutely, yeah.
Very good, very good. So we are overrunning. I could speak to you, James, for 3 hours, but what I want to do now is our quickfire round, very quickly.
Right.
And so try and keep your answers as short as possible. Are you ready?
I feel on the spot, so yes, hit me.
So what's the first word that comes to mind when I say climate?
Crikey.
Excellent answer. Specifically in terms of climate communications, who do you think is the best? Who's the greatest inspiration out there?
For me, SciComms related to climate, Lynn Margulis, who was the co-originator of the Gaia hypothesis, and she described Gaia as symbiosis from space. and I have never looked at the Earth or its climate in the same way ever since.
Amazing. Is there someone else's work that is maybe deserves more attention, do you think?
There's two people. Rachel Donald at Planet Critical. Rachel, she describes herself as a climate corruption journalist, and her podcast and her newsletter is
Excellent,
the
yeah.
place I go to. And then also Ali Rowe, that is leading Lawyers Are Responsible, and she's doing really important work when it comes to trying to get the legal profession to understand the responsibilities that they've got for facilitating fossil fuel use.
Oh, is that the Chancery Lane project, or is that something different?
This is, it's called Lawyers Are Responsible.
Right, okay. What's your favourite book or movie or TV show, a piece of culture on this subject, on the climate crisis?
Venomous Lumpsucker by Ted Beaumont. It's a near science fiction satire about biodiversity offsets, and it is hilarious and infuriating in equal measure. I thoroughly recommend it.
What do you think is the most effective communications channel when it comes to climate?
For me or anyone.
Yeah, for you, this is all about you.
I like to write. I enjoy writing, but in terms of effectiveness, talking to people. So a public lecture, a chat, a talk, anywhere that I can engage and have a discussion, that's where I see things may change.
What's your favourite stat or fact?
The Earth's biosphere is 3.8 billion years old, and it's in late middle age. It's about 65 years in terms of human lifespan, because it's only got a billion years left. In about a billion years' time, the sun would have gotten so big and hot that it won't just boil the oceans, but photosynthesis will draw down carbon dioxide so much in response to the forcing from the sun that all photosynthesis will stop, and therefore the biosphere will be starved to death. So we have about a billion years of life on Earth left.
Wow. What's the one piece of mis or disinformation that you wish could be permanently retired?
Carbon offsetting.
Very good. Where'd you go? What do you think is your number one source of climate information?
Blue Sky, actually.
Okay.
I've curated a really nice feed on Blue Sky. I recommend everyone to get over there if you're not there already.
And finally, is there a go-to analogy or metaphor that's your favourite when you're communicating the climate and nature crisis?
Recently, I talk about the catch-22. We are at the stage of the climate crisis now that we need radical action, but that radical action is going to disrupt politics. Therefore, it's not policy relevant. Therefore, it's not going to happen, which means that we've got even more disruption in the future, and that's going to go on and go on and go on until it won't, right? Until it's probably going to end. So the opportunities that we've got are trying to get out of that loop of insanity.
Very good. End of the quickfire round. How was that for you?
That was, yes. Do I get points?
I don't know. I'm interested to see the patterns. Like, face to face is definitely an emerging theme already in terms of the most effective form of climate communication. From my perspective, it's like it's not quick enough. It's not mass enough. Unless, of course, we could coordinate some sort of mass face-to-face networking, which I see no reason why we can't. Okay, so what's the one bit of advice that you think that you could give to our audience who are climate and nature communication professionals?
Be honest with your inspirations and also your fears, because people respond to authenticity. So if you're generally worried, lean into that, right? But the reason we do this work is not just because of fears, but because of hopes. And from my perspective, I see most agency coming from a place of, let's say, love rather than hate, certainly. I love my family, I love my community, I love what I do, and I love planet Earth. We find ourselves at this extraordinary moment in time, and what we do is going to have extraordinary impacts, not just for years or generations, but literally thousands of years, probably millions actually. And that is an amazing privilege. It also feels like an onerous responsibility. The more that we can take that on board and then act accordingly means that I think you're going to be genuinely motivated and passionate And from that passion, I think is where you see real effective engagement, because people can tell that you believe this and you're genuine.
And that's why 89% of the world's population have agreed and have fought against the most sophisticated, well-funded PR campaign of all time.
Mm.
Because the truth is powerful. It's worth more than $1 billion, especially, when it's so experiential as it is now. So we've probably might have covered this already earlier in the podcast, but I'll say it again. Now, what's the one most important environmental message that you think the public needs to hear?
It's not an easy message to give, but the most important message that the public needs to hear right now is that we failed to avoid dangerous climate change. It's going to get much warmer and things are going to get worse. That means we need to work really, really hard to sustain the sustainability transformations that we have put in place. It is the case that we are seeing exponential deployment of solar, let's say, and it is the case that some countries are being able to phase out fossil fuels. Globally, we haven't managed it. That is a transition. It's like a pathway. That pathway is going to be subject to tremendous disturbance and reactionary forces to try and drag us off that pathway. The more the people that we can recruit to working on that kind of collective vision, the stronger it's going to be. So just the fact that we failed doesn't mean that we're doomed, right? No, we didn't, but yes, we can. So it's in that space. It's a difficult space. We need to craft stories of not just survival, but also flourishing, right? We can make the world much better for the vast majority of humanity. The material conditions could be made vastly better at the same time as stopping the destroying of the natural world. That's the central message, I think.
No, we didn't, but yes, we can. Is that your slogan, James?
I mean, that's what I say. I don't know if I can copyright that.
I think you should. I can see a little TM in the corner there. Okay, last question. If you could influence the climate and edge communicators of the world to focus on just one thing in their communications work, what would that one thing be? So that can be everything from a message to, sort of technical strategy, whatever.
Maybe one thing is carbon offsetting doesn't work. So I mentioned that earlier. It doesn't work, right? If you want to see a material improvement in the impacts that we're having on the climate, you have to stop burning fossil fuels. That's it. You can't continue to burn fossil fuels and then somehow think you're going to offset it at some point now or at some point in the future, because carbon dioxide removal isn't going to be a scalable solution either. Now, if that means that your shiny net zero by 2050 strategy is looking a bit threadbare, then you have to deal with that. And I've worked with a number of organizations about that very thing. They don't want to let it go. I don't want to let go of my 2050 net zero target because. But if you're not willing to do the work to actually implement the decarbonisation, to phase out the use of fossil fuels, to reduce your environmental impacts, then essentially it's window dressing, it's greenwashing, it's denial. So taking those offsets away is going to be extremely challenging, and it's going to even be harder now that we're in overshoot, right? But I think until we can do that, until we can make organizations have these really difficult conversations about how willing are you to really lean into getting off of fossil fuels and actually getting to zero emissions by 2050. If we don't do that, we're just kicking the can down the road, and we can see what the results of that have been.
Unbelievably important, and I wholeheartedly agree, James. So what's next on your to-do list after this? Thank you for your time today. What are you up to next?
You'll never believe I'm writing a paper.
Are you?
I'm writing
an academic writing a paper.
I know, it's my little guilty pleasure. It's about something I call derailment risks. I do a lot of work with a guy called Laurie Laybourne of the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative about this. And the idea that I had a number of years ago was, look, we're all assuming as the climate crisis gets worse, right? Sea level rise, floods, storms, politics will respond, implement the mitigation strategies, phase out greenhouse gas emissions, and then it will get better. But we are seeing a number of examples where it doesn't. the consequence of climate change produce a political reaction which makes it worse, right? So the Valencia flooding in 2004, which was devastating, killed a couple of hundred people, empowered right-wing reactionary climate-denying political forces. And we're seeing that in a number of places. And so with regards to sustaining that transition, that the pathway that we need to maintain to get off of fossil fuels, I see derailment risk as one of the serious obstacles to doing that. And that means we need to be thinking now about how can we stabilize these transitions? How can we make them collaborative, participatory? And the shorthand for that, I would say, is we need to significantly deepen democratic engagement, a real sense of democratic involvement in the transformations of our societies, because that's what we need now. We need societal transformation.
And we need to have those comms strategies ready as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. James, I really appreciate your time. I know how busy you are and how thinly you're spread. So thank you very, very much.
Well, like Marmite, I go a long way. So it's a pleasure to be here today.
Great. Thank you.